How's it going, everybody? This is Brother Phil, Brother Phil Ministries. Have you ever asked yourself, who was Mark in the Bible? Of course, we know he's one of the four writers of the gospel: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But here's a little more about him specifically. The first mention of Mark was in Acts chapter 12, after Peter is miraculously released from King Herod's prison by an angel. Verse 12 says, "He came to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose surname was Mark, where many were gathered together praying." Mark is a surname, a last name, so his real name is John Mark. This fact is mentioned a few verses later in Acts chapter 12, verse 25, and again in chapter 15. Colossians give us another clue about who Mark was. Colossians 4:10 tells us he was Barnabas' cousin, the same Barnabas who accompanied Paul on his first missionary journey. Evidently, Mark was tagging along with his cousin on this first journey to share the good news about Jesus Christ, but he abandoned them after they left Pamphylia to go back to Jerusalem. The Bible doesn't explain why Mark left, but some scholars believe Mark's sudden departure was because of his young age. They suspect his lack of spiritual maturity prevented him from fully being involved in the mission, especially after less than expected success in Cyprus. Acts chapter 13, verse 4 through 12. It's speculated Mark may not have realized how difficult mission work can be, so he returned home. Sometime later, Paul was ready for a second missionary journey. He wanted to go back to every city they had visited to see how the brethren were doing. Barnabas wanted to bring Mark again, but Paul refused. He was still upset about Mark leaving them high and dry. That didn't sit well with Barnabas. Acts chapter 15, 39 through 41. Then the contention became so sharp that they departed from one another. And so Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and departed, and he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. John Mark continued to grow and mature, and eventually he was able to reconcile with Paul. The Bible doesn't explain how they did it, but we know Paul found favor with Mark again because he refers to Mark in a friendlier tone later in the New Testament. Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you with Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, about whom you received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. Colossians 4:10. After Paul's helper went to Galatia and Dalmatia, leaving only Luke from the book of Luke left with him, Paul tells Timothy in 2 Timothy 4:11, "Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for ministry." Whatever Mark did, apparently Paul decided he wasn't that bad after all. Mark's growth in ministry may have been due to his relationship with the Apostle Peter. As you know, Peter was rather familiar with feelings of failure and issues with maturity, so it only makes sense that he took Mark under his wing and mentored him as Mark grew in ministry. Their relationship was so close that some people have said the book of Mark is more akin to Peter's memoirs. Mark had written down everything he heard from Peter, say particularly when they were in Rome. This lines up with the early traditional belief that the book of Mark was written in Rome for the benefit of Roman Christians. So Mark wrote what he remembered as best he could and as inspired by the Holy Spirit. Most, if not all, of the book of Mark was written in Rome sometime between AD 55 through 59, shortly before Luke wrote his own book. It seems to target Roman believers, particularly Gentiles, which makes sense because reaching the Gentiles was a huge part of Paul's ministry. Mark often used Aramaic terms, which he was careful to interpret for his Roman readers, and he liked Latin terms instead of Greek. He carefully explained Jewish customs to them, placed events within the Roman timeline for easier comprehension, and made few references to the Old Testament because they were not familiar with it. Mark did whatever he could to make it easier for the Romans to understand the gospel of Christ. He even mentions Simon the Cyrene, Mark 15:21, because Simon was the father of Rufus, who most people knew was a well-known member of the Roman Church. You might have noticed that the book of Mark is a bit shorter than the other three Gospels. This was intentional on Mark's part. He wanted to present Christ in a short, easy-to-understand manner. He omits Jesus' ancestry and birth and focuses on his good deeds, instead with a special emphasis on the importance of service and sacrifice. And he only refers to Jesus' teachings in short pieces so the audience gets the basic gist while not losing their attention. Mark doesn't talk about himself in this book at all, except in Mark chapter 14:51 through 52. Jesus is being arrested by the temple guards in the Garden of Gethsemane, when, for unknown reasons, a naked man suddenly appears in the background. Now a certain young man followed him, having linen cloth thrown around his naked body, and the young men laid hold of him, and they left the linen cloth and fled from the naked. No one has proof, but it's speculated that if the mob that was following the temple guards went to Mark's mother's house looking for Jesus, Mark would have heard the commotion and decided to check out what was going on. Remember, it was his house where the early Christians assembled and hid from the Jewish mobs while Mark was still a teenager. It makes sense that they would check to see if Jesus was there. Another interesting side note about the book of Mark, it's strongly suspected that the 12 verses of the book were not written by him, the last 12, but added later to account for Jesus' resurrection. The oldest two Greek manuscripts of the book omit the 12 verses, and later versions are rife with Greek words suggesting it was Mark who added them. It doesn't solve the mystery of who did. I don't think it means the Holy Spirit didn't inspire this part. Everything in the Bible is for useful teaching, 2 Timothy chapter 3, verse 16. So even verses like this should be considered for its meaning and compare them to the rest of the Bible. So now you know, Mark was actually John Mark, who wrote one of the first books of the New Testament. Followed Paul in his early missions, became a reciter of Peter's teachings, and ran around the night that Jesus was arrested with no clothes on.